peat smoke, and wet wool, and the iron cold of a house nobody ever visits, that was the whole smell of Cecily Vaughan's married life, and it had been given to her as a wedding present. On the morning after the wedding, her husband handed her into a carriage, shut the door on her, did not get in, and said to his secretary across the gravel, in her hearing, with her hand still on the window strap, that if anybody asked, her grace was unwell. He believed he was putting an embarrassment somewhere it would not be seen. He was in truth handing the only good name he would ever have to the one person on earth who would spend 4 years making it worth something. And when at last he rode north to be rid of her altogether, a whole county would come out to the road with its hats in its hands and thank him, in tears and at length, for a life he had not lived. To understand the man, you have to understand what he did not do, because Adrian Vaughan, 6th Duke of Harrowmere, was not cruel in the ordinary way. He was a coward in one precise place, and everything else was the noise he made covering it. When he was 25, his brother Christopher, 19, the only creature who had ever laughed at him and been forgiven for it, took a fever at Harrowmere in a wet October. Adrian was in London, being brilliant. They wrote to him, and he thought, as young men in the middle of their own glitter do think, that fevers pass, and boys are tough, and there was a dinner on Thursday that mattered. They wrote again 4 days later, and the second letter said come. He ordered the horses for the morning, and went to the dinner first, and was clever at it. He arrived a day and a half after his brother had stopped asking for him. Nobody blamed him. That was the unbearable part. His mother said the roads were shocking. The physician said it would have made no difference, and Adrian Vaughan stood at the graveside in a black coat that fitted him beautifully and understood, with a clarity he never afterwards lost for an hour of his life, that he was a man who did not come. 3 years later, at a house party at Cranmere, on the exact night of the anniversary, he stopped being able to carry it. There was music in the long room and 40 people in it, and he walked out of the middle of them at 11 o'clock, down across the wet lawn and out onto the shingle at the edge of the black mere, and stood there in his evening shoes looking at the water, and he did not intend to go up to the house again. The only soul at Cranmere who saw him go was Cecily Rede, because Cecily Rede was the only soul at Cranmere who was ever awake and alone. She was 21, a poor cousin fetched along to that party to hold wool and mind an aunt's spaniel, and be grateful, slight, brown-haired, grey-eyed, with a stillness that made loud people uneasy, without their being able to say why. She had eaten at the bottom of that table 6 days, and not one of the 40 guests could have said her name. She was at her window at 11, because the room they had given her was over the stables, and she saw a man in evening dress walk down a lawn towards water in October, with the particular unhurried straightness of a man going to keep an appointment. She did not ring for anybody. There was nobody to ring for who would not have made it a story by breakfast. She put her cloak over her nightgown and went out barefoot into the wet grass and down to the shingle and stood beside him, close enough to be touched, and did not touch him. He said without turning that she should go up. She said that she would rather stay, if it was all the same. He said it was not all the same, that she was a girl in a nightgown on a shingle bank at midnight, with a man she had not been introduced to, and that if she had the least sense in her head, she would think of her name. And Cecily Rede said the sentence that decided the whole of the rest of her life, and said it as if she were remarking on the weather, that she had never had a name worth the trouble of thinking of, and he had, and that she would sit down now, because the stones were cold, and she thought they would be there a while. They were there 5 hours. He did not weep, and he did not confess, and for 2 hours he did not speak at all. And she sat an arm's length off with her knees under her cloak, and let him not speak. Towards 2 he began, flatly and in no order, about a boy of 19 who had asked for him. She did not tell him it was not his fault, because she was not a liar. She did not tell him God was merciful, because she did not know. She said once that a man who could not forgive himself was at least a man who knew what a debt was. And then she was quiet again for an hour, and the quiet was the thing that held him. At 4 he began to shake so badly he could not stand, and she got him up the lawn and in at the garden door to his own room, and there was nothing else to be done with him, so she stayed. She built the fire up and watched him from the chair by the hearth until the shaking stopped and he slept, and she thought once about going, and did not, because she was quite clear in her mind that a name was a smaller thing than a life. At 6:30 a housemaid came in with the coals. You know what the world made of it. By Tuesday it was a trap. By Thursday a plot. By the following week the aunt whose spaniel she had minded was telling 3 counties that these quiet ones are the worst, and the Dowager Duchess of Harrowmere came down to Cranmere expressly to look at Cecily Rede for a minute and a half, and to observe that she was exactly the sort of little nobody who lays a snare and calls it kindness. And Adrian, 6th Duke of Harrowmere, who had been on that shingle and knew, past any possibility of being mistaken, that the girl had come out to him with nothing to gain, had asked him for nothing then or since, and had not so much as told the story to a maid, Adrian Vaughan let them say it. He let them say it, and he married her in 6 weeks by special license in a bare church at 8 in the morning, with 2 of his own servants for witnesses, and not one flower, and not one guest. And he stood beside a girl in a made-over grey dress, and made her a duchess in a voice like a man reading a bill of sale. There was no wedding breakfast. There was a carriage in the yard at 9. He handed her in. He was very correct about it. He put her hand on the strap himself and said that the northern property was called Ashwick Fell, that the air was said to be healthy, and that her allowance would be paid quarterly and she need not write to him about it. Then he stepped back and shut the door and said, over her head, to Mr. Nash's secretary, standing on the gravel with his hat in his hands, say, she is unwell. Nash looked at the ground. Nash was to look at the ground about that sentence a great many times in the next 4 years. Cecily said nothing at all. Her hand was on the strap and her face was perfectly composed, and afterwards, when he was old, that was the picture that came for him at 3 in the morning. Not the mere, not the graveside, a small straight figure sitting bolt upright in a cold carriage with her hand on the strap, being told through the glass that she was unwell. He did not hide her because she was beneath him. He was not so simple a villain as that. He hid her because she was the one living creature on earth who had seen him at the water, and every time he looked at her he was 5 hours old and shaking on a shingle bank, and a man who cannot bear a thing will, if he is powerful enough, simply arrange not to see it. Ashwick Fell stands at 1,100 feet in the high lead country, at the head of a valley where the beck comes down white over black stone and the wind has an opinion about everything. A plain grey house his great-grandfather built for a widow and nobody had loved since. 14 rooms, no neighbours, cut off in winter for anything from 3 days to 5 weeks. She arrived in the last of the light, and Mrs. Threlfall, hard, fair, watchful, who had run that empty house 11 years for nobody, took one look at the grey dress and the single trunk, and the absence of a husband, and drew her own conclusions, which were the county's, and which were wrong. The first year she was let alone. That is the mildest way to put it. There were no calls, because the gentry of 3 valleys were waiting to see what the Duke did, and the Duke did nothing, so they did nothing. There were no letters, beyond a communication from Mr. Nash 4 times a year on the subject of her allowance, beginning Madam, and ending your obedient servant. And every spring the London hostesses asked, and every spring the same 3 lines went out in Nash's neat hand, that his grace regretted, that her grace's health did not permit, that her grace was unwell. By the 3rd season it had hardened into a fact. There was a Duchess of Harrowmere, a delicate, retiring creature, quite unequal to town, and the Duke bore it very well. 2 clubs had a wager on whether she existed. A caricature was published. Adrian saw it in a print shop window in Piccadilly, and looked at it a long moment with a face like weather, and then went in and bought it, and burned it, and did not ask himself why, because he had a rule about that. Now here is what he never troubled to learn. Cecily Vaughan had £150 a year of pin money, 2 hands, and a district his family had neglected for 100 years, 3 valleys of lead miners and quarrymen and their people, 600 of them, whose leases said Harrowmere, and whose lives had never once had a Harrowmere in them. And she spent the first on the second, from the first winter to the last, unasked and unthanked. She began with the tithe barn, because it was empty and dry, 60 foot of good stone, with an oak roof, standing at Ashwick village, with nothing in it but a broken cart. She had it swept and whitewashed and glazed, and got a stove into it, and put 22 children in it, and taught them herself 2 years before she found a master she could pay, because the miners' children were growing up unable to read the paper they signed. Then there was the black winter, when the beck froze to the bed, and the carts could not come up, and the price of coal in Ashwick went to a place where a widow simply did without, and was found in the spring. Cecily Vaughan went down to Kirkby Stephen in a farm cart, and stood in a coal merchant's yard 3 hours, and came away having spent every shilling she had in the world, and pledged the next year's allowance besides. And there was coal in Ashwick that winter, and nobody was found in the spring. And there was the sitting up. The Reverend Josiah Bickerdike was 76, and the parish 9 miles long, and a man dying at the top of Grike does not always die at a convenient hour. So the Duchess of Harrowmere sat up, with old women, with children, with a young man crushed in a fall at Nenthead, and she was not squeamish, and she was not pious, and she did not talk. And by the 4th year there was not a house in 3 valleys where the sight of her at the door in the small hours did not bring somebody's shoulders down 2 inches, and every single piece of it she gave to him. Not out of strategy. A cleverer woman would have made a monument to herself and been forgiven for it. She gave it all away out of the stubbornness that was the whole architecture of her character. She was the Duchess of Harrowmere. The name was the only thing she had ever been given, and she was not going to let it go on meaning. In the one place it could still be heard, a family that took lead out of a valley for 4 generations and never put so much as a lamp back into it. So she painted his crest on things. She found a pot of oxblood paint in an outhouse, and a brush with the bristles half gone, and taught herself, badly and then less badly, to letter the Harrowmere arms, the wheat sheaf and the 3 martlets and the motto underneath, on plain deal boards, and the board went over the school door. Then the coal cart. Then the great copper the broth was made in, and when the winter blankets came up from Kendal, 200 of them, she sat in that cold house and stenciled a small crest onto the corner of every one 200 times, until her hands cracked. And every time, at the school door, at the cart, at the copper, at a sick bed at 4 in the morning when a woman took her wrist and tried to thank her, she said the same 8 words, in the same level voice, and she said them for 4 years without one variation. It is His Grace's doing. They believed her. Why would they not? They were not fools. They were people who had been told a thing by a duchess, and had no reason on earth to suppose a duchess would lie downwards. So the North came, slowly and then completely, to love a Duke of Harrowmere who did not exist. A great man, a quiet one, who did not advertise, who had put a school in a barn and would not have it named for him, who had heard about a frozen beck 300 miles away and sent coal and never come to be looked at for it, and who they said in the Ashwick alehouse, with feeling, was the best landlord in the North, and the only one who had never once wanted thanking. He was a man made entirely out of his wife's mercy, and by the 4th year he was the most beloved figure in 3 valleys. In the 4th March, the Earl of Draycott died of an apoplexy at his own table, and Sabine, Countess of Draycott, who at 19 had been on the point of being Duchess of Harrowmere until a little nobody was found in a bedroom at Cranmere, was a widow, 30, magnificent and free. She did not throw herself at him. She was far too good for that. She simply became, over one London spring, unavoidable, saying with her eyes and never once with her mouth that a mistake made at 8 and 20 was not a life sentence, and that there were lawyers and that people did these things. And Adrian Vaughan, who had spent 4 years not thinking, went to a lawyer. It could be done. It was ugly and slow, and would cost him a great deal of money and some of his consequence, and it required first a deed of separation, by mutual consent, signed by the Duchess. So on a wet Tuesday in the 4th April he had the horses put to, and took Nash, and put a folded deed in the breast of his coat, and for the first time in 4 years the Duke of Harrowmere went north. He rehearsed the interview at every posting house. He would be civil. He would be generous. She should have the fell for her life and the allowance doubled, and nobody should ever be able to say he had not behaved handsomely. He was aware, the way a man is aware of a stone in his boot on a long ride, that he had not written to say he was coming, and he told himself it was because there had not been time, and knew it was because he did not want her to have time. They came up the valley on the Thursday in a hard, bright April light, and it was Nash who noticed first. The turnpike man had the pike up before the leaders reached it, and was standing bare-headed in the road. Then the quarry road, and word travels in a valley faster than a coach. Men came off the bank and out of the yard at the smelt mill, and stood along the wall at Nenthead with their caps in their hands, and one of them lifted his cap over his head, and the whole line cheered him, cheered. A dozen filthy, exhausted men at the end of a shift, cheering a carriage, and Adrian Vaughan sat back out of the window and said sharply that he supposed they wanted something. Nash, who had written Her Grace's Unwell 16 times, said nothing. And then at the foot of Ashwick village there was a boy sitting on the shaft of a coal cart, and the coal cart had the Harrowmere arms on its side, hand-painted, a little crooked, in a dark oxblood red, and the boy jumped down and ran alongside the carriage for 40 yards, shouting to the horses, and the whole street came out of its doors. The Duke arrived at his own gate in a state he could not have described, and the first thing he saw in the hall of Ashwick Fell was a woman he did not know. She was standing at the foot of the stairs, with a shawl over one arm, in a plain grey wool dress and clogs, her hair pinned anyhow and mud to the ankle, and she was 25, and she was not the grey child he had put into a carriage. 4 years of that wind had put colour in her, and 4 years of that work had put into her carriage the thing he had spent his whole life imitating. She stood like a person who is expected somewhere. She looked at him for perhaps 2 seconds. Then she said, "Your Grace," and made him a small, correct curtsy, and asked whether he would want dinner, in the voice of a woman asking a stranger whether he took sugar. He had rehearsed 40 answers, and had none. That night the weather came in off the Crossfell, and shut the valley, as it does in April, without discussion, and the road south was under 4 feet of drift by the Friday morning. And the Duke of Harrowmere, with a deed of separation folded in the breast of his coat and nowhere on God's earth to go, was snowed in with his wife. On the Friday he went down to the village, because the deed wanted a witness, and the parson was the only man within 9 miles who could write a fair hand. And because he could not stay another hour in that house, with that stranger being polite to him, he never got to the parson's business. They had the barn doors open, and the sun coming in off the snow, and the whole of Ashwick was in there, because Friday was the broth, and the broth was the schools, and when the Duke of Harrowmere walked in out of the light, they knew him at once, because his was the only face in the valley nobody had ever seen, and everybody had been describing for 4 years, and there was a sort of sound that went through that barn that he had never heard in his life, and then they came at him, not with grievances. That was what undid him. He had spent the whole ride assembling refusals, and not one human creature in that barn wanted anything from him at all. They wanted to thank him. Old Bickerdike got both his hands, and would not let go, and told him, with tears running frankly down a 76-year-old face, that in 51 years of that parish he had known one man to give, and not once want it known. A woman pushed a child at him, and said this was Peter. And Peter could read, and there was nobody in her family had ever read. And would his Grace hear him? A man who had been under 9 ton of rock at Nenthead took his hand in a fist like a vice, and could not say anything at all. And a stout old woman in a white cap came at him through the crowd, holding up a plain deal board, painted a little crooked in dark red, with his own arms, his wheat sheaf, his martlets, his motto, and put it up in front of his face, beaming, and said it had been over the door 4 year now, and they'd not have it down for the bishop. They thanked him for the coal in the black winter, for the blankets, for the master's wages, for the school, for the sitting up. They thanked him for a life he had not lived, at length, in detail, with dates. And every single item was a thing he had never heard of, and he stood in the middle of them in a coat that cost more than the barn and could not accept it, because it was a lie, and could not deny it, because the instant he opened his mouth to deny it, he would be telling 300 people that the Duchess of Harrowmere had spent 4 years covering for a man who was ashamed of her. So he stood there and was loved. It took 11 minutes. It was the worst 11 minutes of his life, and he took it standing, and when it was done he walked out into the snow and up the fell road on foot with his hat in his hand, and did not know at the top how he had got there. He found her in the back kitchen of Ashwick Fell at 4 in the afternoon. She was doing an ordinary thing, stenciling, a stack of grey Kendal blankets on the table, the way you do a thing you have done 200 times, and at her elbow a cracked little pot of oxblood paint with the rim gone black, and a brush worn down to a stub and a rag. Her hands were cracked across the knuckles the way a working man's hands crack, and there was dark red down in the cracks that did not come out. He stood in the door and looked at the pot and the brush and the hands, and something in the middle of the Duke of Harrowmere came away from its moorings and never went back. He asked her, and his voice was not one he recognized, why she did not stop working. She said she supposed he meant the school. He said he meant all of it. He said, with a kind of violence, that she had given a man who never came, never wrote, never named her, never troubled to learn whether she was alive. She had given that man a school, and a winter of coal and 200 blankets, and 4 years of sitting up with the dying, and had told 600 people it was his doing. And he wanted to know why. And Cecily Vaughan set the brush down on the rag and looked up at him with those level grey eyes and told him the truth, in the plainest words that have ever taken a man apart. Because it is my name too. She said it without heat. She was not making a speech. She was explaining a thing she had assumed he understood. She had been given exactly one thing in her life, and it was that name, and he had put it in a valley where it meant 100 years of lead taken out and nothing put back. She had done what she could reach. It was not for him. It was hers. And then she picked up the brush again, because the blankets wanted doing. He got through the Saturday. He did not get through the Sunday. On the Sunday evening he came to her in the little parlour where she sat with one candle. She had 4 years' habit of one candle, and stood at the mantel with his hands behind him and could not begin. And it was she who began. She said quite kindly that he had better give it to her. He said stupidly, "Give her what?" And Cecily said that he had been 4 years not coming, and had come without writing, in April, with Mr. Nash and no valet and a hurry on him, and that Mr. Nash had not been able to look at her since Thursday, and that the Countess of Draycott had been a widow since March, which was known even at Ashwick because the newspapers come up with the carrier on a Wednesday. She said it exactly the way she had said that the stones were cold, and she put her hand out. He did not move. So she said the sentence that finished him, that he need not look like that, because she would sign it gladly, and she would sign it tonight, and she thanked him. Thanked him. He had come 300 miles to be rid of her, and she was thanking him for it, the first thing she had ever asked him for in 4 years, and it was out. He heard himself say that she had not read it. She said she did not need to read it, she asked only to keep the school, and she would take the small house by the barn, and he could have the fell. He said her name. He had never said her name. And then Adrian, 6th Duke of Harrowmere, took the deed out of his coat and looked at it, and put it in the fire, and watched it go, and turned round and said the only true sentence he had in him, that he did not want it, and that he had no right to say so, and that he knew it. And Cecily Vaughan looked at him a long moment with an expression he could not read at all, and said, "That is a pity," and went up to bed. He stayed. The road opened on the Tuesday, and he stayed, and there began the strangest 6 weeks in the history of the Vaughan family, which the county still talks about. He carried coal. That is not a figure of speech. On the Wednesday he went down with the cart, because a man was short, and carried sacks on his back up 19 steps at Greik cottages, until the coat was fit for nothing, and he was extremely bad at it, and he did it all day. He went into the school and sat down on a bench built for a child of 10, and was corrected, publicly and with immense satisfaction, by Peter Sowerby, aged 8, on the pronunciation of a word Peter had learned from a duchess and Adrian had learned at Eton, and Peter was right. He learned the valley's names, all 600 out of a notebook, and got them wrong, and was laughed at, and went on. And in the 5th week old Matthew Kirkby began to die at the top of Greik, a slow, bad death of the lead in his chest, and the parson was 76, and it was 9 miles up on a filthy wet night. And the Duke of Harrowmere went up on foot, and sat in a chair by that bed 3 nights, and did not talk, and held the old man's hand at the end, because there was nobody else to hold it. He was not being good. He knew exactly what he was doing, and so, watching him from the door, did she. He was a man who had not come when he was sent for, and he was making up the arrears, 9 miles at a time, in the only currency there is. The Countess of Draycott wrote in May a beautiful letter, 3 pages, not one word of it graspable, and he answered it in 4 lines, and never saw her again. She told London he had gone strange in the north and made himself a curiosity, that there was a wife, apparently, and a school, and London agreed it was a shocking waste of a duke. It was the last time anybody in that town said his name with any interest at all, and he found, examining himself carefully, that he could not make the loss matter. He did the rest of it in the church, on the last Sunday in May, before 300 people, because it was the only thing left he could give her that cost him anything. Bickerdike had been going to bless the new school. Adrian asked for the pulpit stairs, and stood on the 2nd of them, and told them the truth, that he had not put the school in the barn, that he had not sent the coal in the black winter, that he had not been 300 miles away thinking of them, because he had never in his life spent 1 minute thinking of them. That the Duke of Harrowmere they had loved for 4 years did not exist, and never had. That he had been ashamed of his wife, because she had once seen him at his worst, and had been kind about it, and had sent her up here to be got rid of, and told London she was ill, and never come, and that everything they had thanked him for in the barn, every board and cart and blanket and hour, was hers, and had always been hers, and she had put his name on it because it was the only name she had, and she would not let it be a curse in this valley. He had expected, he said afterwards, to be hissed. What happened was worse. 300 people turned round in their pews and looked at her. The whole church, in one movement, like wheat going over in wind, away from the Duke of Harrowmere on the pulpit stairs, and onto a woman in a grey dress in a box pew at the side. And in that moment, Adrian Vaughan became a nobody in his own name, in front of everyone, which was precisely what he had done to her on a gravel drive 4 years before. And he had to stand there and let it be done. And old Bickerdike got up in the silence afterwards, very slowly, and said, mildly to nobody in particular, that her Grace had been telling them these 4 years that it was his Grace's doing, and that it was the only lie he had ever known her to tell, and that he would ask the congregation to forgive her for it. They laughed, and then they cried, and then they sang, and the singing was not for him. She came to him in the churchyard afterwards, with the whole valley pretending not to watch from behind the wall, and he could not look at her. She said he had made a great mess of that. He said he knew. And then Cecily Vaughan named her terms, on a wet path between the graves, quietly, as she had said everything else, and every one of them was his own wrong turned round and handed back. She would not go to London, not ever, not this year and not in 10. He had told the world for 4 years that she was not fit to be seen, and she was not now going to be walked round Mayfair as his interesting reformation. She had been made a thing to be hidden, and she was not going to be made a thing to be shown. She would not be presented. She would not have the caricature answered, or the wager settled, or the town told anything whatever, and the school was hers, and the money for it would come out of her hands and not his. And then she looked up at him with the rain coming off the yews and put the last of it plainly, that she had no objection to a husband, that she had, in fact, thought about it a good deal on a shingle bank once, and had not much changed her mind since, but that if he wanted a wife he could come and live where he had put her, and stay, and not go down in October when the road got bad. Here, in the wind, where the name was. For a proud man there was a whole life in that, and he did not take a moment over it. He said yes, he was 36 before he saw London again, and then only to sell the house in Grosvenor Square. The 7th Duke was born at Ashwick Fell in the wind, and the county came up the fell road for 3 days to look at him. It was not a fairy tale. Adrian Vaughan did not become a good man in a church on a wet Sunday. He became a man who came, which took him the rest of his life, and which he was still practicing at 70, badly, and every year a little better. But there is one picture the valley kept, and it is the one worth keeping. It is the June of that first year, and the new school door is hung, and a plain deal board is waiting for it on a trestle in the sun, and the Duke of Harrowmere is on his knees on the flags with his coat off and his sleeves turned back, holding a brush worn to a stub over a cracked pot of oxblood paint, doing the wheat sheaf and the 3 martlets himself very slowly, with his tongue between his teeth, and making, everyone agreed, an absolute disgrace of the martlets. And his wife stood over him with her arms folded, and let him. And when a child came up and put her chin on the trestle, and asked whose doing the new school was, the Duke of Harrowmere did not look up from the brush. He got the last martlet wrong, and he said the 8 words it had taken him 4 years to learn, and he has said them every day since, to everybody, whether they asked or not. It is her Grace's doing. If this story of a proud man and the wife he hid held you to the last of the light on that fell, do a kind thing for the tellers of it, press the like button, and share it with a fellow lover of grounded historical romance, and deeply drawn slow burn drama. Subscribe to The Duke's Undoing so that you never miss the next chapter of a powerful man learning. Too late, or almost too late. Exactly what he threw away. And tell us below, for we read every answer. She gave him the credit for 4 years of her own mercy, and it gained her nothing. Was she right to do it, or should she have let his name rot in that valley and put her own over the school door from the first day?